over to the sports team for Football Frenzy. And then Black Coffee will be here for Talk Night with Black Coffee. Abuja, welcome to Hard Facts. My name is Kimberly Nwachukwu. Call me Kim, the Oracle, the Digital Oracle, OTF, Madam Speaker, fellow, and I will say yes to them all. As long as we have a great conversation, we'll be fine. And I'm positive that it's going to be a great conversation. Coming into the studio, he said it, for 1 second, I thought it wasn't going to rain, but it rained heavily in my neck of the woods, and it's still drizzling or even sprinkling out there. And I'm sure in some part of town it's still intense. In some places, perhaps, the cloud is gathering. At one point, the cloud gathered so intensely, I was thinking it was an alchemy or so situation. For those who've seen the Korean drama, you know what I'm talking about. But if you haven't seen it, don't worry your pretty head. Let's get just into the big stories of today. Roundtable would be slightly different today, as would focus more on evaluating the 2023 election, the just concluded governorship election, and just generally look at how it was conducted, the gaps and areas to close for future elections or by-elections, and other observations during the election. I'll be looking at it from the perspective of our guest, who is a research analyst from the Center for Democracy and Development. So it would be a conversation mostly around that. But I would also bring you up to speed with some of the big stories that Nigerians are talking about today, aside from more of the announcement coming from INEC. Zamfara State, I think they've called it already. Who won for Zamfara State? Plateau State has been called already. Adamawa State, inconclusive. Kaduna State has been called by INEC. The APC retained it to Basani is there. Zamfara State, I think, is the PDP. I will give you a few more of the detail. I'm sure we'll be bringing it to you in all of our bulletin. And also, the presidential candidate of the Labour Party has said he would petition the outcome of the elections. He has gone to court with that, I think, swung into action at this point in time to saying it's not just going to be just huffing and puffing. He intends to do something about it, and he has gone to court. Besides, the mantra is go to court for every single person. He's decided to take that action and actually had about 5 prayers put forward before the court, 5 of them. Would touch on that much later in the day once we're done with our guest and a few other updates. But for the conversation we'll be having today, we have Mr. Afolabi Adekaiyeoja with me in the studio, research analyst. He's with the Center for Democracy and Development. I'm delighted that you're able to join us on the show. For 1 minute, I was praying the rain doesn't slow you down, but thank you for making it.
Thank you for having me.
Delighted. So let's start off saying to be looking at, evaluating the elections generally. I've read a lot of articles. I've listened to a lot of Nigerians' opinions are a bit diverse as to how the election played out, if it met expectations or not. Some people like, it's way below expectations. Others said, well, it's the Nigerian factor. I wasn't expecting anything to be 100% perfect, but we can't altogether just condemn it. It had some successes as much as it had areas where we need to cover in the near future. It depends on who you ask and what political divide they're on, or the vision they have for the country. Opinions will be diverse. But we'll be speaking from your perspective, research on the ground, and putting fact, figures, and opinions together to shape this. So starting with, the general overview of how the governorship election was conducted based on your findings and research.
Thank you. So what we did was we looked at the presidential elections, and then we also tried to look at, even just previous antecedents and the expectations that we had, like you already discussed, about the different factors and the different stakeholders and actors in the election. One of the things that we were quite, quick to pick up on was that when you're looking at Nigerian election process, and even when you look at things in Nigeria in general, it's very easy to attribute it to one particular organization or particular agency. And one thing that we were quite strict with doing was trying to really unpack where the issues are. So it's a case of who's in charge of logistics, who's in charge of accounting, who's in charge of security as well, because these are issues that we really quite touched on. And I think one of the major issues that we've had, and our report like is actually out on our website right now, and it came out this afternoon, really just looks at the fact that INEC had a role to play, and there were areas that INEC definitely should have improved on that it did not. Now, there were some parts that you can really speak to in terms of where progress was made. So looking at the fact that more polls opened on time during the governorship elections than they did on 25th of February. Looking at the fact that there were more materials, that were actively devolved into the different parts of the country. So in terms of some of the criticism that we had raised about INEC during the first election, they had largely tried to address that. And then, of course, as IREV, when it was during the presidential election, only 10% of the results had been uploaded within the first 24 hours. By the time it was going to election, it was actually 80%. So it was a case where there was much more improvement, at least on those particular areas. Now, the biggest challenge really when it comes to looking at elections is that it's not just about one particular institution or one particular, part of the country. You're looking at a very, very large country to run. In fact, to put this into context, if you added the registered voters of every other West African country together, it would not be up to the number of voters that were registered to vote in Nigeria's elections this year.
Okay.
So it really just gives you the scope and the scale of what's going on when you're looking at Nigeria's challenge and even just how it is to run an election in the country. Now, one of the issues that we were quite concerned about was that there's one part to actually set the structure for the elections, and there's the other part of the people who actually take part. Because ideally, in an ideal situation, what you would find is that all the different actors are responsible and engaging on that particular part. Now, the challenge is that two of the major things that we picked up on was violence and vote trading. So there was a spate of violence issues around the country. It wasn't limited to one particular part of the, any particular state or geopolitical zone. It was actually quite, prevalent. And these are things that we were quite concerned about because no single person should come out to perform as important a role as voting and feel unsafe and feel like their lives are at risk. And it's quite possible, and there's not been research done about this, but then even just based off anecdotal evidence that this is the reason why the voter turnout would have reduced when it came to the election, because quite a number of citizens felt unsafe and they didn't want to actively risk their lives coming out to vote in an election that they didn't feel really confident in. So violence plays a very major role, and the challenge there is now about
in the low turnout,
and also in the way the elections were conducted. And one of the biggest questions now becomes who's responsible for security, and that's where you're looking at the security agencies. So now we had observers around the country, and one of the major things that they picked up on was that the presence of security officials at polling units was reduced. It was drastically lower than it was during the presidential election. And now that's a really big cause for alarm, because the concern really now comes down to what would have played the role and how would that have enabled or emboldened other non-state actors to actively try and play a part in trying to disrupt the election process. And then the third thing, like I mentioned, was voter trading. Right? And then this is now where you're looking at actors, you're looking at also financial crime institutions, but then also at the end of the day, the mindset that we have when it comes to elections. You had citizens who were actively, telling party agents that they would not vote unless they had been mobilized. You had party agents that would creep into the lines.
Was it widespread, the observation of this?
For voter trading, yes, it was widespread.
During the governorship election?
It was not limited to any particular part. In fact, one of the things that was quite concerning was that there was another level of creativity when it came to voter trading, because it wasn't just about cash. It was about materials, there were phones, there were rappers in different parts of the country. It was a case where anything that could almost be given in transaction for a vote was almost utilized, especially during the polling, especially at the polling units. You had agents who would enter the line, pretend as if they were trying to queue and vote, and then they would start telling people that, okay, if you vote for my candidate, I can give you this, I can give you that. And this was actually very prevalent. And one thing that was quite concerning was that it wasn't even limited to a particular zone, a particular party. Like there were quite a number of parties that we saw our observers were actually able to record having taken part in this particular activity. Now it comes down to to two things. One, like I think as I spoke earlier, somebody can actually say, okay, I'm going to try to pay for your vote or to get your vote. But then another thing is for you to actually want to receive it or to actually have that transaction. So it comes down to the way that we also engage with the process. And in the 3 weeks since the presidential election, many people can attest to the fact that there have been complaints, there have been issues, concerns about how the entire process, actually unfolded. And many citizens may have felt that there was no need to actively try and take part in the process that they felt was already going to be flawed. So when it comes down to it, three things really played a very big major role in the elections. You already had the fact that there were logistical issues that INEC had improved upon, but had not also reached the level that we should expect and demand as citizens in an election process. There was the challenge about violence. So violence played a very big role, and that also deterred and also affected targeted voter suppression and intimidation of voters in particular areas, and that played a very big role. And obviously that brings into question how citizens should feel safe in their particular part of the country, and even the legitimacy or the people that come out. And then third is voter trading, because at the end of the day, the different issues in the country, the social political dynamics played a very big role in people feeling as though there was no need to actually engage and that they could even just sell their votes to the highest bidder. Now, all of these three things don't really make for a very good ultimate outcome. But the question and the challenge there is that it's not a case of it just being one particular factor, one particular agency, or particular part. There's a collective ecosystem involved, and there are different actors that play a role in this particular process, and all of these different groups.
By the actors, we're looking beyond just the umpire of the election,
beyond
to
just
the
the
security, the electorate themselves, the political elite
exactly
in all of this. Because people would say, if we're talking about from the vote trading to the violence to the voter suppression, you can't tie that to the electoral umpire and the organizers, but looking at perhaps maybe negligence on the part of the security agency, or perhaps turning the other way, not doing their job as it should have.
They should.
And then the political elite also influencing some of these things are misguided people, because it was recorded in quite a number of places. Even on election day, a day before, there was still heightened violence and people still being killed. And following a report, about 21 people died during the course of this election. So it tells you it's still pretty much frightening. What does this do to the credibility of the election?
So the challenge when it comes to even just discussing about credibility is a case where, at the end of the day, there's the extent to which somebody can actually call the election, the data and information that is there, and then there's now the legitimacy of the person that comes in. So how do you feel about the person that is there? Do you feel like the person is actually representative of the views and the votes of the people? So for context, it's the kind of thing where when you look at some election turnout, so the national average for the presidential election was actually just under 30%, but then that was still a reduction from what it had been in previous cycles. And then there are some states that have gone as low as 10% in terms of the voter turnout, right? And then that just tells you that they didn't get 10%. They got the majority of 10%. So that just shows how, there's still a very large part of the population that they still, that may or may not even feel as confident or comfortable with the direction and the policies that have taken place. So there's that challenge when it comes to that. Now, ultimately, what this now means is that whenever people come to an election, they use the idea that this is a mandate that's been given by the people. So I had my manifesto. I said, I'll give you an example. Let's assume people are running for Nigeria, for FM, CEO, and I say I would change the colors to red and blue. And then if many people don't come out to vote, but then of the people that did come out to vote, I won. I'm on that impression that the colors have to change because the people that brought me in said so, and it might not be a popular decision, Exactly. So it's really that kind of perspective when it comes to legitimacy, and then that usually influences credibility, because at the end of the day, it still comes down to how we and how the different structures interact with the results of the process. We already have international organizations and observers and countries that are congratulating the different winners. There is still the refrain, like you mentioned during the initial roundup, about going to court so that the judiciary can actually really play a very good role in interpreting the results. And then ultimately, it still comes down to the fact that the machinery of state is still moving. Very soon we expect the incoming president to name a transition committee and then to start planning the very difficult task of moving from campaigning to actual governance, which we've been very, very clear that with the way politicians and the way parties have been really doubled down on some very divisive rhetoric, is going to be even harder than the results. The results already show us a very divided country. And it's going to be even harder to now actively try to govern and actually try to make sure that you can reach out to try to say, okay, fine, I know that I did not get your vote, but I will try to earn your confidence exactly during the period that I'm in office. So it really comes down to the way that we interpret these things, right? The challenge is that there's no set metric of saying, okay, fine, how many of you said this? Because at the end of the day, the results will still be translated into the way it's done. So it's a case of how we now walk around the different structures that interact in terms of looking at credibility.
So, but generally, it looks from what you said, did we see a depreciation between the presidential election of the 25th of February and what was conducted on the 18th? And would try and compartmentalize it, looking at it from the part of the umpire, INEC, between the presidential and the governorship. From your finding, did we see, in terms of the process of conducting the election and all of that, was there an improvement compared to how they did it for the presidential election, as much as we'll go also to the general security comparing the presidential and National Assembly election and the governorship election, if it was a bit more during these just concluded election compared to the presidential. I mean, sometimes this can also help, and perhaps put this kind of report together.
So our reports are already, like I mentioned, they're on the website. But then one of the biggest issues, I think it really comes down to, and it's very apt that you use the word umpire when it comes to describing INEC. So I don't know how many listeners are active football fans, but then there's this, very, very, very common expression that when the match goes on and then you don't really notice the referee as much, you get the idea that, okay, fine, things have been going smoothly because when the calls needed to be made, they were made. When the calls needed to be left, they were left. And then, things just generally kept on going as they should. And then the players and and their performance itself determined who won the match. Now, the concern really is that, if you even look back to previous off-cycle elections, so Ekiti and Osun, for example, most of the narrative around the conduct of the election was focused more on issues of voter trading, issues of, mild voter suppression in that particular regard. But then there was very little that actively looked at, okay, fine, did logistics get transmitted on time? What did INEC rule? What was INEC's role? In fact, when it comes to IREV, part of the challenge in terms of expectation was set from that particular process, because Osun's elections, for example, IREV largely updated every single thing by 2 a.m. night of the day after the election.
Okay, so, can we take you up on this after the commercial break? Let's run for a quick break, and when we return, we'll take it up from how Osun performed. Stay with 95.1 Nigeria Info. Hello. My name is Kimberly Nwachukwu. I'm the host of Hard Facts, and I bring you the biggest stories driving conversation every weekday here on 95.1 Nigeria Info Hard Fact Show. I love to get your opinion and conjectures, but the facts you cannot dispute here on Hard Facts. Join me and let's talk.
Nothing breaks the news like the news. Trust me, I can prove it. I do it every morning on Morning Crossfire from 5 a.m. to 9 a.m. on Nigeria Info 95.1, and I'm Femi D. Amede. Join the biggest conversation around the national politics every day in a way that is trustworthy, full of passion, and yes, covers the biggest politics and the stories that matter to you. See, you have all the reasons to find out what's going on in Nigeria and be engaged differently. Let's talk. That's the way to go, even this morning.
I keep my sunny side up so they can see me from above. I keep my sunny side up. No more running from the. This is Nigeria Info. Nigeria Info. This is Nigeria. This is Nigeria Info.
Break, so let's join them.
Seriously work on my music skills. Let me use my
Nigeria Info. This is Nigeria Info. Nigeria Info. This is Nigeria Info. Nigeria Info. This is Nigeria Info. Nigeria Info.
Nigeria Info.
Nigeria Info.
This is 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 Nigeria Info.
Report will say allegedly. Okay. And we have Toru Andrew Atoruge. Atoru. I hope I got your name right. Forgive me if I didn't. Good afternoon, Kim. The only election that INEC has done without complaints is the governorship and state assembly in Benue State. If not, for the presidential election, I rate them as 0. Thank you, says Andrew from Gwarimpa. Absat Mazu is watching. Kesu Chenna says, good afternoon. Thanks for the good work you're doing. God is our strength. Talking about this year's election, INEC chairman has demonstrated that our vote, really doesn't count. I wonder how other parts of the world and Africa will perceive us for this election. Ozon Namani says in Enugu, is watching live from Enugu. That is good to know. And if you're just tuning in, you've met some chunk of the conversation having with here, who is a research analyst, Afolabi, Adekaiyeoja, and he's been talking about findings and research on the election that just recently concluded. They have their report out. But just before the break, we were talking about Osun State and how early the reports, the results were uploaded because people commended that process and were a little concerned that we couldn't replicate it during the presidential election. Just concluding your point there.
So just like you mentioned, part of the concern there was that, IREV had the results uploaded very quickly. The election was called very quickly, and most of the attention during that particular corner was actually looked at voter trading and the issues and the mild issues there of voter suppression. So that was the last major election that INEC conducted before before these particular polls.
Yeah.
So that was the last expectation, and then obviously a lot has been made around clarity around the transmission of votes and the online particular aspects. So to be fair, a lot of these particular challenges now also comes down to INEC's, poor communication with Nigerians. Because even when it came down to the presidential election, when the results weren't getting uploaded on time, INEC should have played a very big role in terms of actively, managing that conversation and then actively going forward and saying, okay, actually, this is where the challenges are, this is what's going on right now, and this is why you can still trust the process and the integrity that is there. The issue there is now that this didn't take place for another 24 hours. And then by then, different conspiracy theories had already gone around why the presidential results were not being uploaded as quickly as the National Assembly results. And that already played a very big role in terms of, really questioning the integrity of the process.
Of it, yeah.
Now, when we go to the governorship election, that had largely changed. There was a very clear process, and then things were actually uploaded very, very quickly. So that shows, at least on some level, the level of you can say mild progress that INEC had made, between the 3 weeks of the elections. But ultimately, the challenge still comes down to the perception, right? Because even if anyone comes and says, this is what INEC was dealing with and this is what INEC did, if you don't feel, if a Nigerian doesn't feel as though this process actively represents what they're doing, then that's really where the challenge is. So ultimately, it comes down to where INEC, especially in regards to the role that INEC has within the election process, which is very important. But then, there are still other actors that are there, the role that INEC has and what INEC can do to really try to ensure that Nigerians feel faith in the process going forward. Because we can't forget that there are 3 off-cycle governorship elections in November this year. So we will still be going back to the polls in a couple of months, and then we have to make sure that ultimately, all the ideas and all the concerns from this particular elections are addressed, and then going forward.
But
and
it feels like it feels a bit more staggering when you're having the general election.
Elections.
I mean, you're dealing with the entire country in one breath, or you're dealing with 28 states when it's happening. Logistic challenge and all of that will be more pronounced to when you are having one state happen, and 2 months later another state happens, or the next day you have another state happen. And that's why it felt like a fine moment for Osun State, in spite of some pockets of overvoting that were still recorded eventually. And this one was just almost
very
like
big. Exactly. And I think one of the last things, especially on that point, is that the country, you're never going to find a uniform experience when it comes to certain of these issues, right? So even if it comes to the performance of the government today, there will be states that, if the president was running for re-election and was on the ballot, that he would still carry because they would still feel confident and comfortable and really impressed with his performance. And there are states that would have changed. So it's really also a case where when it comes to a federal institution like INEC and when it comes to dealing with in a country like Nigeria, especially with the different structures and some national units, that's another added challenge where, no 2 recs will be the same, no 2 experiences will be the same, no 2
classic example, Kaduna State, the rec in announcing says we're not going to take the one from IREV. It was going to be manual in calling the results. And in, previous, I think it was it Ogun election or was it Osun election? Yes. And he says, okay, I'm not going to go with any manual one. We'll follow the one that was on the IREV.
And even
so
Adamawa too recently.
Adamawa became inconclusive based on that also. So you can see different interpretation where someone will tell you that the guidelines supersedes what is spelled out here in the Electoral
Act and the Constitution. And then even if you look at the personnel that are there, right, because REC is appointed by the president and confirmed by the National Assembly. So there are different stakeholders involved when it comes to the electoral process. So ultimately, it's the kind of thing where no one can say that there are any actors that were absolved or blamed. In fact, Nigerians ultimately were victims of this protest because ultimately what you expected was to go out, vote, come back safely, hear the results, and know that everything had gone out according to the way it should have gone. And the fact that, days after, weeks after, we are still having these issues, candidates are going to court, really just speaks to how much more progress there is still to be made when it comes to the election process in Nigeria.
All right, then. Well, but let's look at, you did touch about the key critical observation, the violence, voter suppression, and the vote buying that we noticed. It will also be nice to understand, did we see it a bit more pronounced, the recently concluded election, compared to the presidential? Because when we had the presidential and National Assembly election, cash crunch was still pretty much, it was tight. It became a bit more flexible with the Supreme Court position to say, okay, let's have more cash in circulation. Could that be the reason why perhaps it was recorded more, if it was observed to be more pronounced during the governorship election, if that was one important factor that played out?
So we did actually see an increased record of voter trading and violence in the governorship election than the presidential election. And there are different reasons and different factors for why that could be the case. So one, you already touched on one, which is, the fact that by the time citizens went to the polls to elect governors, the Supreme Court had already waded in and the government had already agreed as well. That, and which is in its own self a very different issue to even address. But then there was a clear consensus that okay, fine, old currencies will be legal tender until the end of the year. So that would have played a very big role in even being able to give particular candidates or particular parties or people like the war chest to really go to town when dealing with the elections. But then one of the biggest issues also comes down to the fact that at the end of the day, all politics is local. And we've already seen over the last couple of years the growing influence that governors have in the country's politics. And the fact that a lot of parties, a lot of candidates needed to make sure that they could still hold on to certain positions and to that access to revenue and certain positions that they had. And that meant that governorship elections were going to be much more contested than the presidential election. We can't forget that out of 28 elections that we had for governorship, 17 of them were going to elect new governors. So it was a case where there was going to be very big, really fight to ensure that they could deal with that. You also have some states where the governors were elected on different parties, but then had defected over the course of the last presidential term. So you had parties that were trying to reclaim those states. You had parties that were trying to maintain those states. You had candidates, you had politicians that had defected, that were trying to seek positions. And so there were many different underlying stories when it came to the election process. And what that meant was that for the presidential, it's so much more difficult to rig the entire country. So you have areas where you're not as strong, or areas where someone else is even stronger. So they're going to be different. So it's going to be difficult or harder to do that for an entire country. But then when it comes to a state, when it comes to particular LGAs, that's a whole different kind of fish entirely. And then that's not where the challenge comes in. So what we were seeing was a case where you had, different, demigods, the godfathers trying to assert control in their fiefdom. But then you had people who were also trying to push back.
Oh, yeah.
So you had these different dynamics that were in play on a much more local level. And ultimately, at the end of the day, citizens are much more, connected to their governors, to their state house of assembly representatives, because...
But they say politics is local.
Exactly. It's closer to home. So it's the kind of thing where that was always going to be a much more contested election process. And I think that's something that played a role in really aggravating this whole sense of do or die politics to a whole different dynamic. And unfortunately, that played out in the way it did.
Now, going by the report put out, it showed that the Northwest Observers, 7 states reportedly increased report of vote trading, primarily by political party agent. Money was used alongside other materials such as food item, wrappers, credit vouchers, and these items were redeemed after the result. Similarly, in the Northeast, political party agents in Taraba infiltrated the queue, pretended to be voters, and used the chance to offer cash for votes. In the Southeast, there was report of Abuja and Labour Party agents using material phones and other souvenirs to entice voters in Anambra State in the South. Multiple states reported a desire for voters to show proof of their votes before being paid, with party agents reportedly compiling a list of their voters in Eastern Central local government of Edo State. And, it's across board, the different geopolitical zones. Apparently, we saw the different level of voter inducement play out, as much as we had violence recorded in different parts also of the country. And thuggery, very pronounced in the reports that came out also.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of video evidence to that effect. And, the thing is surprising that we're still reduced to this level, the basic level of employing this during our elections.
Yeah.
It's mind-boggling.
So I think ultimately, especially when it comes to looking at violence and voter suppression and intimidation, really just speak to how important of a decision this was going to be, in really making sure that governance is really elevated. And I think one of the biggest tragedies of this entire cycle would be that if after everything that's gone on, there's a simple, dismissal of the importance of actually following through when it comes to civic engagement, actively keeping these leaders on their toes, because clearly they've shown how important it is and why it's necessary for them to do, to carry out the various actions that they've carried out. So it's really about trying to make sure that if the structure is much more balanced, if there's a much more enlightened electorate, it's going to be harder for many of these groups to actively carry out what they're doing. And ultimately, eventually, hopefully, we reach a point where we have a better and much more, at least that much more better, perfect democracy.
Democracy. All right, let's go back to you now. Look at some of the messages. Watching from Maitama Extension, Chris Joseph. John Ali Hena says, has Kaduna been announced? Yes, it was last night, and I think Ubasani I know for sure that what was announced was Ubasani of the APC. It was a narrow margin, but as who's been announced for Kaduna State. We'll take a few phone calls in. Call us up on 0700 951 0000 or 0809 5974869 or 0809 9930 137. Hello.
Hello, Kimberly. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, it's me, Nasara, calling from Mararaba.
We're listening.
Yeah, I'm an active observer in the elections across board. I observed the elections along the central Nigeria. And
you can't be all over central Nigeria in one breath. Where did you specifically observe?
I was in Plateau State. I was in Benue State. And I was in Nasarawa State too. And
in one day, May Nasara.
Yeah, hello, yeah, I'm with you.
I know, I was thinking in one day you were spread thin this much in one election.
This thing is like you have a network of observers.
Okay.
And then I did the presidential, and then I did the gubernatorial too. So I'm not the only one. We share, we send, we have a WhatsApp.
Okay, that's better. Go ahead. Go
We send
ahead.
videos, we send observation, like the functions of the beavers and the transmission from beavers to IRF and the timely arrival of the materials and the conduct of people, violence and what have you. And from our deductions, we observed that there was a massive improvement, most especially from what transpired during the presidential elections. You understand what I'm saying? Yeah. Across all boards, the people's wishes were fairly reflected in the elections. And that's why you can see that it is very different. Some people there are a lot of takeovers, like in many states. Like you see people that have no money have become members of House of Assembly. It happens in many places. So by and large, I think we're supposed to appreciate that there has been a gradual improvement in the conduct of elections in Nigeria. It's very
Thank
clear.
you very
There's no
much.
two ways about it, yeah.
Well, let's know where your report is published. Hello.
Hello. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the show.
And good afternoon to the Nigeria Info listener and callers as well. My name is Salasi.
Go ahead.
Yes, I participated for the last week election. Yes, there's little improvement in the aspect of coming on time. Do you know, I cast my vote as early as 7:30. That is it. It shows that they came on time.
Before the election time was even officially open?
Yes.
Because it's meant to start at 8. 8:30.
It's supposed to start by 8. But they are there around 7. Before 7, they came early. And they started testing everything. After that, 7:30, I was able to cast my vote. But the problem is that vote buying was open. Open. You see people selling their vote at the rate of, even with 1,000 naira, some people could sell their vote. And it was open without any restriction. And the security man wasn't anything. They were just looking at people, how they were in kind of being cast. You buy the vote, when you complete, you show to the person that, yes, see, come and see, I have already buy this, and there wasn't any restriction. The security man wasn't doing anything. So that is it. So in the aspect of vote buying, in fact, that is why I saw most of these governors were in kind of crying about this money issue or something like that. Maybe that is why they were in kind of worried about this, the money. You could see them buying votes.
All right.
Where the EFCC and the ICPC and the other agencies, I couldn't see it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello.
Afternoon.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Kim. Good afternoon.
We can hear you, sir. What's your name?
Yeah, my name is Chris. I'm calling from Life Camp.
Go ahead, Chris.
No, the reason I'm even calling is that is it allowed for one to cast their vote even before the official sign? I'm even surprised. And then maybe that's actually the reason why there was vote buying and what or what not. I don't even understand. I wanted him to throw more light on why the reason why the voting started before the official sign. Does it make it legal? Are those votes cast before official time legal? I don't understand. That's why I'm
all right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's hear another caller. Hello.
Hello, Kimberly. Good afternoon.
Welcome to the show.
This is Honorable Minister of your mic.
Go ahead, sir.
Let me tell you. Let me say, the materials arrive in time is no matter. Something you are going to do.
Well, it's not so normal. I mean, given the fact that we had a presidential election 3 weeks back, and you saw the delay.
That is their own negligence of duty. Because this is something of 4 years that we are going to conduct one. So that one doesn't, they are doing their work. And when you talk of the vote to buy, I think I've seen in television where they say, yes, it's RFS 65. Where are they? Is they not to them? Let us see. Where did they vote good? Is it not what this man said, the former commissioner, Barrister said of AIT, that look at it, they are going to add figures. Is it not what we see on this thing? Beating people up and down, injuring people. Where did they progress? They progress in error. Okay, now I want to ask a question, or ask the guest the question. Now, you know that whenever they go to court, they say they're going to recover their mandate, stolen mandate. Now, if you now come out with a gun and have people do everything.
All right, Honorable Minister, please off your mic. Summarize in 10 seconds.
You become the president or the governor. That is, you rob people. How do you think people will be listening to at you?
Thank you very much. And we'll take this call and get back to our guest. Hello?
Hello.
You're welcome.
Good evening. This is Leko calling from Museto. I greet our guest in the studio.
Okay.
I hope he's still there.
He's still here?
Yes. Hello.
Okay. Oh, thank you. I want to look at this election palaver from another angle. The angle I want to look at it from is that I want to see it like INEC is, in this election game, INEC is just a pawn. The reason why I say so is this. I think the success of the election lies in the hands of our security agencies. I think our police are the real reason behind the problems we had in this election. Now, let's look at it from this angle. If they were doing their duties as they were supposed to be doing it, and the INEC officials are secured, they know they are secured, I bet you that they will do their job the right way they are supposed to do it. But when you are being threatened and you are in a place, perhaps you are even a stranger there, and then the people that are supposed to secure you are not there, or they are there, they don't even care. Did you hear about the other man that was, whisked away at the spot?
All right, sir.
Having elections, and then they now discovered his dead body. Now, if you look at all these scenarios, I don't think any official will be able to do their job as effective as they're supposed to do.
All right, sir.
So I don't want to blame INEC for it. I think the problem is the security agencies.
All right, thank you very much. Talking about the security agency, Solomon Udostin says, whoever is expecting to change the crop of questionable politicians for better ones via electoral process. Okay, we'll leave your comment out. Thank you very much. And greetings to our guest, Sonny from Gariki. Sir, you have acknowledged the prevalence of violence across the country. Now, how do we rate the performance of security agencies as it concerns their contribution to the integrity or otherwise of the outcome of the election? Comrade Chris Zocha from Madala, reacting to the recent concluded election, we're marred by a lot of irregularities. The scenes of our electoral umpire are still crying out. What still was the our law enforcement agents were complicit when the citadel of justice is questioned. What happened to the body polity? Okay, I'm trying to understand your message. To get Nigerian election discussion, cash scarcity presidential election has nothing to... Okay, some of your messages I don't understand. But let's get back to you. Just respond to some of the thoughts there as we look at also. I mean, we talked about the violence, the security. You start to wonder if we had an increase of it in the governorship election, that security was caught napping or were overwhelmed.
I think one of the biggest challenges when it comes to the structure in the country, especially when it comes to like many of these areas that are actually centralized and then now need to get devolved. They're looking at governance for starters, but then also security as well. It's really trying to ensure that there's a balanced approach, one that creates a much more uniform experience, but then also trying to really identify what the challenges are with much more nuance, right? So it's a case where you might see that there are certain communities where there's a prevalence of security officials in the urban areas and then less so in rural areas. It might be a challenge about trying to really bring out of the box thinking to try to solving these issues. So whether it's a case of having much more centralized polling units or even trying to really ensure that the polling units that are selected, especially after INEC had removed around 240 polling units that had no one registered earlier in the year.
And they had to redistribute.
People, exactly. But they're making sure that, when these redistributions are carried out, that there's effective security actually attached to these particular polling units. Now, one of the biggest challenges with conducting an election in Nigeria is that INEC has to go, or even the people who are getting involved have to go almost everywhere. So, for example, you're looking at somewhere in the south, you can actually only access the polling units, either by swimming or by canoe. There are areas where you have to go through very, very long, dusty roads to actually get there. And they're different, and all of these different positions they actually have polling units that people have to vote in. So it's not just even the experience that many people might be used to in, much more urban areas like, the capital and Lagos. It's actually very, very widespread and very different. So the challenge is now that when we're actively trying to engage with solutions, right? Because at the end of the day, it's one thing for us to complain about what's going on. It's one thing for us to say, okay, fine, these are the problems. And the best thing is that everyone in Nigeria, anyone who is, who has engaged in the process on one level or the other knows what the problems are. We are very adept at being able to pick them out.
Yeah.
Now, the challenge is now, okay, fine. When we sit down and start trying to find the solutions, how do we see them? Where do we see them? Part of it actually even looks at the fact that security officials can only be, quote-unquote, compromised if there are inducements to do so from other particular actors. It might be a case of how we reform engaging with political parties. It might be a case of how we inform, the actual deployment of officials and making sure that there's a stronger connection, not just between the the citizens and the entire structure, but also citizens and even the law enforcement agencies, making sure that there's stronger community correction. Because one thing that is even, in fact, there was a joke that was going on social media about how there was a person who had snatched a ballot box, and then the police officer said, "Ibenabo, come back here with the box."
Okay, I think
because in the case where
they kept calling his name.
Exactly, they knew the person who was there. So these kind of things make it much more personal, and it makes it harder when you're trying to actively, try to curb or to go against these particular issues. Ultimately, the challenges that are there, right? It's not just today that it started, right? So there's no single, innovation that carried out in terms of, trying to circumvent the law. Exactly, that was not considered before. So now one thing that we actually are recommending is
to get your recommendation after this break. Quickly.
Okay.
Is an announcement.
It's Nigeria Info.
Nigeria Info.
This is 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 Nigeria Info.
Nigeria Info.
is Nigeria Info.
Nigeria Info.
This 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 is Nigeria Info.
Census Commission. And then what that would do is that would focus primarily on the tasks that people expect INEC to be doing. So, for example, one of the recurring complaints is that if Nigerians and INEC can see what's going on in particular areas, that then they should be able to wade in and say, okay, fine, this election is not this election is not that. Especially when you look at issues of in Adamawa and Kebbi that have been ruled inconclusive. But then there were many issues and many incidents in Lagos, for example, and people are saying, okay, fine, why haven't you ruled those ones inconclusive? So it's a separate commission to do that. Now, I also share the skepticism of the fact that, okay, fine, that would be just another office that's created to do more work and then much more bureaucratic. But then part of the challenge here, or part of the ease there, would now be, okay, fine, if you have very, very defined mandates, very defined positions, and then make it much more, leaner and tighter, then that this organization comes into effect, towards the election period and is actually able to really function and deal with that. That should even free up INEC to do something really important, like, for example, campaign finance regulation, ensuring that, okay, fine.
We're not even talking about that.
You see, exactly, because it's the kind of thing where there is no way that, that you can say that some of these parties and candidates have, really limited to the particular financial limits that have been set for campaigning. And that's a whole different issue that, if was actually enforced and monitored, then that would lead to a different outcome when it comes to elections. So ultimately, the major recommendation really is a case of making sure that Nigerians are still watching. Because, because after this election period, the idea or the assumption is that things will not pass on and then people will just forget and ignore. But if Nigerians are actively still managing and engaging in the civic space, then things can hopefully only get better.
All right. I think we'll leave it at this point. I want to say a very big thank you to Afolabi Adekaiyeoja, research analyst. Thank you very much for being on the show with us.
Thank you for having me.
To share a bit of the findings, and thanks to the CDD. I mean, the report, would check it out and build on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bivan is here for the news at the top of the hour. The roundtable continues after the news.